we'll get into something happy soon. So Iraq is this. it's this country about 6,000 miles from here. I don't know if you've heard of it. So there was. Oh, it's called Iraq. Iraq. When I say that, people think I'm saying Iraq. So I had to go back to like the Bush Senior pronunciation so that Americans could handle it. Iran. So for a long time there, in between 9/11 and I don't know 2004 maybe, a lot of my circle of folks who had all been involved in the kind of corporate globalization movement, and now we're about to go to war with Iraq. It's very clear, or we've already started. We being us, the U.S. military, and so. Sometimes I realize I'm saying we when I'm talking about people that disgust me. I'll say we when I'm talking about Pentagon strategists. Because I didn't send anyone to war in Iraq. But we were looking for a connection. Well, so how can we connect in the way we talk or in our writings? The war in Iraq with economic globalization. And it was this big dumbfounded wow, I don't know. And then it was oh, I know, Iraq has the freest markets in the world now because immediately upon occupying Iraq, Paul Bremer puts all these laws into effect that privatize the entire country. I've got it. I found out how we can connect this. It's exactly the same issue. They're just doing it through direct violence instead of through paying a militia to go to the government for them, which didn't work. So, it hit me. Right. And that's what I was talking about earlier in wars having the same aims as our economic policy. There's a lot of countries in Latin America the U.S. was on the verge of invading in the 80s, and sometimes sent a couple thousand Marines, or in the case of Panama, they invaded and bombed the testing ground, right? But for the most part, the U.S. was able to achieve the same aims through covert operations, through funding elections, through putting massive amounts of money in the right places, and all of that. If you look back with Iran, the U.S. overthrew their government in 1953, right? Mossadegh, and reinstalled the Shah of Iran. And the Iranian Revolution that led to the Islamic State was basically a direct attack on that event, and that was sort of one of the first events where the CIA was straight up overthrowing governments and stuff. And they went there and they paid mobs. They paid this dude's enemies to overthrow him. He was democratically elected. And it was because they had nationalized oil, and that's the same reason that we were cool with Saddam Hussein, and then he was all right, I'm nationalizing the oil, because British companies owned all the Iraqi oil, because the British invented Iraq, right? They drew the border. And they said, you guys gotta leave, this is our oil, because we live here, this is our land. And they were all right, you're an enemy. That sounds red. Like that, right? So switch to fast forward to right now, Iraq, and we, the U.S. military, are have now built the largest U.S. embassy in the world, in the middle of Baghdad, in the green zone. Don't worry, we're not planning on staying there forever. We just built the largest U.S. embassy in the world. It's got 20 buildings. It's got and we've built all these permanent bases. And a base isn't just it's not a fort full of soldiers. It's corporate strips, movie theaters, bars, and stuff like this. It's intense. It's entire towns. So the song is called the Baghdad Vatican. And it's because the spot we've built in Iraq is the size of Vatican City. And it operates much the same, it's its own spot in the middle of the country. And there is a really dirty labor story going on inside of it. And this is a song really about that, about who's building it, because it's not U.S. soldiers. Boarding up on the plane, they never India and Ghana. First Kuwaiti general got the contract. Went to the poor states to make the compact. Come along, you unemployed, we've got some work abroad. With passports stamped for Dubai, the planes took off. One worker knew what was in store. Forced labor in the middle of a war. Locked inside the green zone, they would live their lives like this, housed in little crowded rooms, working unpaid shifts. First Kuwaiti drew the plans, July 2005. 100 acres, 20 buildings, fully fortified. A permanent enclosure, the State Department's dream. The largest U.S. embassy the world had ever seen. Surrounded by the heat, the daily bombings, house raids, checkpoints in the streets. Inside would hide the bankers of the corporate enterprise, assigned to build the export plan to suck this country dry. First Kuwaiti, the IMF, the oil tycoon, taking downtown Baghdad and making it Cancun. Owned by people who will never be the amputees, built by cheap labor, import economic refugees. Everybody's seen it, yet somehow no one knew. They tell a lot of stories, you gotta question if they're true. Of course, no one in the State Department knew anything about the story. Bare feet on the rebar, and another day begins. Threatened by the guns of the bosses. Trapped in a situation that no nightmare could conceive. They would die here like this, with no way to leave. First Kuwaiti withheld their passports and their papers, kept them locked inside this compound, guarded by soldiers with no health care. They were drinking water from the tigers, full of diseases and the bodies of organizers. Everybody's seen it, yet somehow no one knew. They tell a lot of stories, you gotta question if they're true. The Baghdad Vatican, like an oil rig in the sea, built by the ancient U.S. tradition of slavery. A road placed strategically in the empire plan, financed by the suffering of the people of this land. First Kuwaiti, the State Department, everybody knew. If you'd been inside the green zone, you had to. 2,700 workers tricked and trapped